Recording. All right.
All right.
Before we begin, if you will, please introduce yourself for the interview.
I'm Otis Sanford, and I'm a journalism professor here at the University of Memphis.
Okay. Let's see. All right. Before, let me preface this before I begin. This might seem a little bit rigid as far as the questions are kind of thrown out. Kind of bear with me. I'm just trying to do it for consistency's sake.
Okay. Sure.
If you encounter a question that you already answered, just let me know.
Okay.
But the way that's kind of structured, it might happen that way.
All right.
Okay. So, first question. This is more about engagement and social media. How would you say social media has changed journalism?
Wow. So many different ways. First of all, journalists now report in real time using social media. They reach audiences that, especially if it's newspaper reporting, they reach audiences in social media that they never reach with a newspaper. But same for broadcast as well. They reach audiences that don't watch television news. And again, it allows journalists to report what's happening in real time. It also teaches journalists how to be succinct with their reporting and go straight to the facts of what happened very briefly. So it helps with brevity. And in some cases, it has allowed reporters and journalists to add a little bit more perspective to what's going on, because they can continue to post things and add perspective to what they see happening. So it's a lot of different ways that social media has changed journalism.
With that in mind and that change, so a lot of journalists today, they talk about engagement with the audience kind of being an important factor. Do you agree with that? Do you think that that's an important element as far as the journalists have to concern? Or have to be concerned?
Absolutely. It's very important. One thing I didn't mention about how it's changed is it has allowed journalists to have conversations with the audience. The audience can give them instant feedback, either on Twitter or Facebook or whatever social media platform they're using. They can engage with the audience. So that has actually changed the way journalists do the job. It is a real factor in how journalists report. You know, sometimes journalists will even get a question from somebody in the audience, and then they can go find out that question in real time. So, you know, all of this is good because engagement is the name of the game in journalism. And if you are carrying on in a real-time engagement with the audience, that helps you, that helps the readers and viewers, and it helps the reporting endeavor.
So with that in mind, and as far as with an interaction with the audience and that engagement, just talking about you specifically, for example, when you're communicating with the audience, is it sort of were you focusing more on like strictly engaging, like keeping it kind of even, or are you more focused on allowing the audience to participate, in your work? As you said, them posing a question and you following up on that, potential story leads.
Well, my work is a little different in that I'm an opinion journalist. So I use social media quite a bit to put my opinions out there. And I get feedback on that. I get pushback sometimes. I get people who agree with my analysis or my opinion. But I also get questions too. And I try to answer those questions as I go along. I deal mostly with politics and social issues. Also from a historical perspective, because I'm a big historian, political historian for the most part, but also other history things. And so I might get some questions on social media sometimes when I post something about, well, didn't this happen back in 1960 something? And me being a historian, I mean, I try to answer those questions. So, yeah, I mean, for my personal journalistic endeavors, I use social media a lot. Again, it's mostly about posting opinions, perspective, sort of trying to give some context to what's going on, and that engages the readers quite a bit. I have quite a few followers on Twitter and quite a few friends on Facebook.
What since you mentioned that you kind of heavily use social media, that's fair to say.
Say that again.
That you heavily use social media as far as your work. Is that fair to say?
Heavy. Well, I mean, heavy is a relative term. I use it regularly.
Okay, that's a.
I'm not a heavy. I mean, I don't post things all day, every day. I don't even. Sometimes I may go a day or two without posting something. But I'm a regular user of social media. Let's put it that way.
So, what are the types of social media that you use?
I use primarily Twitter and Facebook. I very seldom use anything else.
Was there a particular reason that you chose those two, or is it?
Well, I
preference?
mean, I'm more familiar with them. I think that for what I do, which is news and commentary, I think my audience is more tuned to those two platforms. I think they are the simplest ones to use. Again, with Facebook, the audience that I think follows me and my opinion journalism, they are primarily on Facebook. Same with Twitter. Again, I just found them. Those are the ones I'm comfortable with. I don't use Snapchat and LinkedIn and things of that nature. It's just that I never got accustomed to using them for the kind of stuff that I do. So I stick with just those two.
Okay. What would you say are some of the challenges that you face in engaging with your audience with social media?
Well, I don't really have any major challenges. Again, I'm fairly well known in the community from my work in more traditional legacy media, newspapers and television. So my recognition factor is fairly strong. And so I don't really have any challenges there. Most of the time, if I post something, especially if it's controversial or if it's very, very topical, I will get responses all day long. Sometimes I very seldom post personal things, but sometimes I do because I think the audience, sometimes I like for them to know me in a personal way. So I will post on rare occasions personal things about my background or about my family, mostly my deceased mother and father, because people have I've written about them in the paper before. So, but I don't have any major challenges or any problems using social media, and I certainly don't have any problems getting responses.
Kind of talk about those responses and readers' reactions to your work. And this might be kind of an unfair question because it depends on the piece.
It depends.
But have readers would you say that they've reacted positively to your engagement with them online, or?
It's a mix. I would say, if I had to guess, I would say that I get more positive than negative, primarily because people who respond are people who tend to agree with me. But I get a lot of people who don't agree with me and who push, especially if I'm talking about politics, especially national politics, and especially if I'm talking about the president.
Right.
Then I get a broad mix. It's still probably more people who would agree than disagree, but I get a lot of people, at least 35%, who will disagree, and then that will carry on the conversation because people who agree then respond to that. Then we just have a dialogue going, especially on Facebook.
Right.
So, and all of that's fine with me. I'm, as long as I'm having a public conversation and as long as the debate is respectful, sometimes it's not. Sometimes people resort to name calling, which I don't like that. But again, unless it's really wild, I won't step in. But it runs the gamut, but mostly people who agree with me, because the ones who don't, sometimes they tend to just not respond at all.
Kind of switching gears a bit from, I guess, the consumer side, how do you consume online news? Like, do you have any go-to sites, or do you consume it mostly through social media like Facebook, or is it a mix? How would you?
Oh, I generally consume my news through apps from various things. Obviously, I consume all of the local news. I still get the printed Commercial Appeal delivered at home, so I read that every day. But I also have the Commercial Appeal app. We have a new news organization in town called the Daily Memphian,
Right.
in which I write for now. So I get that 2 times a day. I get a morning edition and an evening edition. I look at all of the websites for the local television stations. Mostly the one that I work for, Channel 24, but I also look at Channel 3. Occasionally look at Channel 5, and then I watch television news, including national broadcasts pretty much on a nightly basis too. I am a news hound. I'm a news junkie, so I consume all of that. In addition to all of that, I have apps for the New York Times. I'll look at the Washington Post. That feed comes through, mostly it comes through my email. Sometimes I get push notices on Facebook. But I don't necessarily use Facebook for my news consumption. I use direct apps because I want to know where my information is coming from. Now, I look at my Facebook feed or my Twitter feed, but a lot of the times headlines and things will come that way, and I don't know where that stuff is coming from. If I can't find a legitimate, familiar source of that information, then I'm not clicking that on. That's not anything I want to look at. So I generally go to the more traditional ways of getting it, either by an app or by a website, and I also look at Fox News as well. So I'm a broad consumer of news, using more traditional methods than just social media to get the news.
Okay. Well, you pretty much kind of, I think you touched on this next question a little bit, but I will still throw it out. So what are you, when you're consuming news, what are you looking for from your source? Like what's the...
I just want to know what's going on in the world and what's going on locally and statewide and nationally. Again, I'm more involved in politics, so I pretty much consume most all political stories. Certainly I want to know what's going on locally, whether it's crime related or business related or just a nice feature story. I mean, I read, I just want to know what's going on locally. But nationally and internationally, it's mostly politics.
Okay. All right. So this next section, we'll kind of deal with questions concerning credibility.
All right.
So, and I guess the first question I would ask is, how would you, as far as online news, how would you define credibility, or how would you measure it?
As far as online news, well, again, it depends on the source of the news. I tend to give more credibility to traditional news outlets that I'm familiar with. The ones that have been around for quite a while, but may have, they're giving you news online now. And I'm talking about the legacy news media. Locally, that would be the Commercial Appeal, and the television stations, and more recently, the Daily Memphian, and the Tri-State Defender, That's what I do. That's what I look at locally. Nationally, I look at the major networks, NBC, CNN, ABC, CBS. I consider them credible. I will look at Fox, but I know Fox has a point of view. Most of the time, I don't agree with that point of view, but I'll just see what they're talking about and how they're covering a story as opposed to how MSNBC or CNN covers it. I certainly give credibility to the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, the LA Times. I even look at the BBC from time to time to see what international news organizations are saying. Sometimes The Guardian. I have apps on my iPad that are sort of like news aggregators. They go out and they just sort of collect news from various sources and put them in one place. It's called, one of them is called Flipboard, although I don't know if Flipboard is still in use. And another one is called Zite, Z-I-T-E, and they sort of, I put in there what I'm interested in. And I'm interested in politics, I'm interested in entertainment, I'm interested in sports, and they will sort of aggregate a lot of news that I might be interested in, and then I can just flip around for articles. So I do that. So again, my credibility factor has to do with whether it's an established legacy media that I can trust, because I believe that news organizations such as the Times and CNN and CBS, and while they're not perfect, they have a set of ethics and set of standards that I support and uphold, and that I follow as a journalist. So I'm looking at their credibility like I want somebody to judge mine, which is always about seeking the truth, trying to be as accurate as possible, and trying to be independent and accountable.
How do you think online news has changed the idea of credibility? And you've kind of touching on that a little bit in your last response.
Touching on that again. It depends on the source. I think some news gets bandied about. We have no idea where it came from. And the truth is, fake news has been around for a long time. It didn't just start with the current president. He has sort of co-opted that term to make it fit a certain thing that he doesn't like. But people have been producing fake news before he became a politician. And people have been putting stuff out there and hoping that people will pick it up on social media, for example, and spread it around. Well, that's been going on for a while. And so you really have to look at the source of all information online to see where it came from. And if it didn't come from a reputable source, I would look at it with a jaundiced eye, because there's a lot of misinformation, outright blatant lies on social media. And so I have to, and they have no credibility with me. So I have to look at the source before I make up my mind whether I'm even going to look at it. And if I look at it, the source has to be there that I believe is reputable.
And this next question, you've pretty much kind of answered it, but
ask it again.
Yeah, just bear with me. How do you think social media has changed the perception of credibility as far as in online news?
Well, again, I think there's just so much incorrect information out there, and people who there are a lot of people who use social media who, for the most part, never looked at traditional news, especially newspapers. There are a lot of, especially young folks, who have no history of newspaper readership. They didn't grow up reading, if it's local, they didn't grow up reading the Commercial Appeal, or they didn't grow up reading the New York Times. And so they don't have an association with traditional news organizations and understand that they are credible, and they check their sources, they check their facts, they make sure that they are accurate. That group, along with others, are now consuming news on social media, and they can't tell the difference between fake and real. They have no idea. And so they naturally probably assume that all of it is real, because if it's on Google, it must be true.
Right.
And that's not the case. But they don't know that because, again, this is not meant to be a put down. This is just meant to state a fact. If you don't have a history of understanding how news is produced and what it takes to produce news by reputable, trained journalists who are taught to go and verify, check out, double check, triple check sources, and make sure that you are accurate by verifying information. If you don't understand that that's what journalists have always supposed to do, you'll fall for anything. And if it's online, it must be true. Well, that's not the case anymore. And so that's a long answer to your question. But that's how I see how credibility has been impacted by online.
Okay. All right. These last few questions in this section is kind of bringing it around as far as relationship between social engagement, and credibility.
Okay.
So do you, after everything has been said, do you think that there is a relationship between social engagement online and credibility? You've kind of sort of touched on that.
Absolutely it is. Yeah. I don't know how I can elaborate any more on that. It is incumbent upon news consumers to, if you're going to engage with any news online, it's up to you to make sure you know where that news is coming from and whether it's trustworthy, and not just fall for anything that's out there. So, the answer to your question is yes. I don't know how I can explain that even more.
Gotcha. And you've pretty much kind of explained this, but how would you kind of describe that relationship between those two? It seems like the way you've explained it, there's a complexity to it. So
you mean between
social engagement and credibility is
social
concerning on
engagement
news?
and credibility? Yeah. Again, I think, and maybe I'm repeating myself here, people who have always been a consumer of news, even before social media came along. Social media is a relatively new thing, especially the major platforms. They've only been around about a dozen years, so less than that for some. But people who were engaged with news before that, they had a set of criteria that they relied on to determine whether things were credible. When you went to and I tell my students this, when people my age went to the supermarket and they looked at when they were checking out their groceries, and there's this whole row of tabloid magazines, and you saw the National Enquirer, or you saw the Globe, or you saw something else, and it had a headline that says aliens from outer space came here, and now one of them has been adopted by Hillary Clinton. Well, you knew that was just
right.
And you knew what that was.
Right.
That's fake news.
Yes.
And everybody knows it's fake news. Even if it could be right beside a People magazine, which is a little bit more credible. It could also be beside Newsweek and Time, which are credible. But people knew what they were getting.
Right.
And if they wanted to pick up even the National Enquirer, when they're saying that, Barack Obama and Michelle are getting a divorce. Well, we know that's not true. But if you wanted to look at that, you'd look at, but you knew that was a lie. Fake news. Online now, it's not easily discernible because folks just put stuff out there. and it's all mixed in, and you don't know where things are coming from. And so that, to me, is a big problem for people who don't understand how news is how people get news, who the source of the news is, and whether they have the credibility based on their history. So, again, I hope I'm answering your question here, but it just seems to me that we have to do a little bit more educating ourselves about where news comes from and who's getting it, to determine whether it's believable or not, and not just believe everything and then spread everything on social media just because you saw it somewhere.
And this last question may be a positive spin, and you've kind of touched on it previously in the other sections, but do you still think that, as far as, engaging with your audience online, social media, you think that can work together along with aiming for credibility for online news? Do you think that they can kind of coincide?
Oh, I think it can.
Okay.
It should. Engagement and credibility should go hand in hand. Again, I hope, even if people fervently disagree with something that I may say on social media, even if you disagree with my conclusion, my perspective, my analysis, I don't ever want it to be said that I'm just not credible. Now, people might say that, but they may be saying that based on the fact that they just don't agree with my opinion. And I clearly make sure that people understand it's my opinion. I'm not a regular news reporter. I did that in my career. I was a reporter for a dozen years almost. And then I was an editor for a dozen more after that, maybe longer, where I did, just basic objective reporting and editing. But when I became an opinion journalist, then I used all of my experiences from all those years to give my perspective and my opinion on what the news is. Still reporting the facts, still being accurate, still doing everything I can to be fair. But again, this is my perspective. And my credibility is on the line. Even if you don't agree with me, I still want to be credible in the eyes of people who see my work.
Okay. Those are all the questions I have. Is there anything else you just want to say or add that you feel you have had a chance
No,
to?
I think you've asked some very thorough questions, almost like a prosecutor. So I think you've done well. I don't have anything else to add.
All right. Well, I apologize if it seemed like a prosecutor, but I'm thankful and grateful that you were able to take the time to.
That's
do
a
this.
compliment, because prosecutors are supposed to be thorough. And if they have to ask something a different way 3 or 4 times to get at what they're trying to get at, then they've done their job. So you've done a good job.
Well, thank you, sir.
Okay.
All right.